Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
What is the state of play for 2022? Senate Democrats have jumped right back into their lengthy agenda in the new year with Build Back Better negotiations still on the table. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pushing hard for a voting rights bill to be passed. It's also obviously a midterm election year. COVID's still rampant across the country. Republicans are hoping to end this year on a high note for that election. For this and more, we'll bring in our panel. Founding editor at the Washington Free Beacon and AEI resident fellow Matt Continetti. National political correspondent for NPR, Mara Liasson, and Fox News congressional correspondent Chad Pergram. Chad, this month it seems like it's hard to imagine Build Back Better getting a better positioning as far as a vote or restructuring. But where does it stand?
Well, Democrats start the new year basically where they were at the end of last year, looking at Joe Manchin. There's been a little bit of conversation about, do they start to do some specific bits and pieces of this bill? What do they do with the child tax credit, which is very expensive? How do they pare this back? But what I find notable as they start the new year is that Democrats, even though Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, said we're going to have a vote on this sometime early in the new year, they are more focused right now on voting rights and trying to use the anniversary of January 6th as a fulcrum to pass their voting rights legislation and maybe get Joe Manchin, maybe Kyrsten Sinema, to agree to alter the provisions with the filibuster. Now, that remains to be seen. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, says he wants to do something on that by Martin Luther King Day, the 17th of January. But you need all 50 Democrats plus Vice President Harris on board to change these provisions in the Senate. And heretofore, we don't see any movement on that front.
Mara, I mean, do you think they can move that ball before they move other balls?
That seems unlikely, but who knows? I mean, once again, everything depends on what Joe Manchin wants. And he sponsored one of these voting rights bills. It was much pared down from the original Democratic wish list. It included, for instance, a provision for voter ID, which is something that Republicans have always wanted. He wanted to see if he could make it bipartisan. So far, he's only gotten Lisa Murkowski. Chad can correct me if I'm wrong, but only one Republican has signed on to that bill. So the key would be to convince Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, maybe some others, that a carve out to the filibuster would be justified to pass a voting rights law. And not even just voting rights, but clarifying what happens after the voting is done. Excuse me, what kind of leeway state legislatures would have to decertify or throw out results, or clarifying the Electoral Vote Act, clarifying the role of the vice president in certifying electoral college counts. So there are a lot of things in that bill, but once again, it all comes down to whether Joe Manchin is willing to carve out an exemption to the filibuster so the Democrats can pass it with 51 votes.
You know, it feels a little bit like, Matt, Wile E. Coyote. I mean, they know that the anvil is going to fall, but they keep coming back at the Roadrunner. And am I wrong here in that when Manchin and Sinema say they are not moving on really altering and changing the filibuster and the 60-vote threshold, that there is no yes there?
Well, it's funny because you were said Wile E. Coyote, Brett, and I was thinking Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football. So there are just a whole host of comic and animated metaphors for what the Democrats have been up to over the past year and look to be up to in the coming year. Here's what's really going on. I think a lot of this is motivated, this persistent tact that, you know, we're going to continue to fight for Build Back Better, and we're going to try to fight for the two voting bills, and we're going to try to change the filibuster rules. It's about placating the left ahead of the midterm election. Democrats can see the numbers. They see that independents are fleeing from the Democratic Party, heading toward the Republican Party. They see Joe Biden's approval rating And they are very worried that should the left, their base, abandon them as well, what looks to be a bad election for the Democrats could become a disaster. So a lot of this, I think, is just kind of pumping up the base ahead of the campaign.
Chad, on Capitol Hill, is there word that Manchin is somehow making a negotiated effort here, that there's going to be some negotiation where he gives in on the filibuster in order to get something else?
Well, he said consistently that he is against changing the Senate rules. And as you and I have spoken about off the air many times, in order to do this, a nuclear option, you're not actually changing the Senate rules. You change the Senate precedent. The Senate does a lot of its business based on custom and precedent, and that's what we saw with the nuclear options in 2013 and 2017. But again, Democrats, what they're really doing here, this is important to tie this to 1/6. Politically, tie this to Martin Luther King Day, voting rights, the state of Georgia. Keep in mind there's going to be a competitive re-election bid for Raphael Warnock in Georgia later this year. And Georgia has been, almost ground zero for some of these the voting changes at the state level. So what Democrats are trying to do is not only apply pressure on Joe Manchin, but also resonate with their electorate to say, hey, we're trying to get something done. And who's at fault here? Well, it's the Republicans. They are filibustering the bill and then kind of reverse engineer that to pressure Sinema and Manchin to say, can you at least give us one of these two bills here, Build Back Better or the voting rights legislation? Keep in mind that even Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont, who is about as passionate about the Build Back Better bill as any Democrat in the Senate, he has said that the voting rights piece of legislation is more important than Build Back Better.
Guys, let's hold it right there. We'll continue after this.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network, download and listen to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. The host of The Story on Fox News Channel sits down with major newsmakers each week to get their untold story. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Mara, the administration could desperately use a win. They are facing headwinds. Inflation doesn't seem like it's letting up. The Afghanistan after effects are still happening. Russia is aggressive, may invade Ukraine. China is aggressive, has hypersonic missiles. Iran doesn't seem like it's sitting at the table. And, you don't really have a lot of wins happening for the Biden administration.
You don't have a lot of wins, and you're not even sure if you got a win legislatively, whether it would change the Democrats' electoral prospects. Now, I think Build Back Better is something that at least is more in their control than inflation, Russia, China, or Afghanistan at this point. So you can imagine a scenario for Build Back Better where the bill is exactly what Joe Manchin wants and not a penny more. He has suggested in the past, both in a written handwritten memo, I think, to Chuck Schumer, but also in public comments that he wants there to be fewer things in it. He wants them to be fully funded, not to expire after a couple years. And he's more open to some of them than others. The child tax credit, which kept a lot of people out of poverty, just expired. He seems to want to tackle that in a bipartisan way in a separate bill. Mitt Romney is for a child tax credit, a different form of it. So I think that of those things you mentioned, Build Back Better is the thing that is the most likely, if Democrats are going to get any wins at all, it's the most likely thing to happen. But it would mean, once again, the left wing of the party swallowing hard and agreeing to exactly what Joe Manchin wants.
Meantime, Matt, this COVID situation and the mandates, vaccines, masks, what to do with kids in school, it really is dividing the country. And different states are handling it differently. But it seems like the health experts have all kinds of different messages that have come out, and they try to clean up on aisle 4 each time something goes sideways.
Well, a lot of the health experts in the recent weeks have been sounding like some of the kind of out of the mainstream critics of public health policy at the outset of the pandemic. We've heard that cloth masks don't work. We've heard that we shouldn't be counting cases. We need to focus on hospitalizations and deaths. Clearly, the vaccines, even if you're boosted, you can still get a breakthrough case. But here's the difference. The difference is Omicron, Brett. And I think Omicron changes everything. It's a different disease, basically. It doesn't appear to be as lethal. It's less severe. It does evade the vaccines, but I can speak as someone whose wife had COVID last week. She had a she had a pretty bad cold for a few days, and now she's recovered. I think the fact that the prevalence of Omicron is going to drive people to the point where they just stop listening to the public health authorities, and they begin, I think, really demanding the relaxation of a lot of the mandates and measures in the coming months.
Yeah, Chad, because how is it playing on Capitol Hill? First of all, you have a lot of lawmakers who have had it, COVID, and more in recent weeks. But then you have this disparity between federal mandates and actions, and the president telling governors, well, there's not a federal solution for COVID.
Well, that's a problem for the Democrats when the president says that, and they have repeatedly said and repeatedly criticized former President Trump saying, do a better job with COVID. You're right. This is a different type of virus, this Omicron variant. There's probably going to be more. The question happens politically as to whether or not Democrats might use, much as they're trying to use 1/6 here to pass the voting rights bill, do they use the rise of Omicron and make this the new de facto COVID bill? That's something that has been, chattered about here. The realpolitik on the ground, though, is, are they going to have, whatever they try to move, enough healthy senators to move this? You had Senator Elizabeth Warren test positive just before the recess here. I mean, you've had nearly 40 members of the 117th Congress test positive. You have had a bunch test positive just since December 18th. So if you have Congress coming back into session, does this thing run rampant through the building? Already the attending physician at the Capitol, Brian Monahan, has already sent out a memo urging members and committees to do stuff as remote as possible over the next few weeks. Keep in mind that they have remote voting in the House of Representatives. They do not in the Senate, and that could impede their ability to move that bill. Even if they had the votes just before Christmas time to move Build Back Better, they couldn't have passed the bill because they had Democratic senators who were out sick.
Yeah. And Mara, as we get these messages, they had the quarantine going from 10 days to 5 days. And now there's a consideration by the CDC, at least according to Dr. Fauci, that they will recommend at least a test at the end of the 5 days. Well, that sounds great if you can get a test.
Yeah, now testing, of course, it's ironic. Testing was the one thing that hadn't been politicized, or at least yet. And it wasn't part of the culture wars. But it also was the thing that the Biden administration really fell down on the most. They just didn't make testing widely enough available. Now, that is changing day by day. Biden has said he's going to have the 500 million tests available. And as somebody who actually has Omicron right now, I know that it's easier to go to the pharmacy and grab a whole bunch of home tests and even to make an appointment to get one. So, yeah, testing will make a difference, because if you can test and find out you're negative, you don't have to sit at home for some quarantine period. But the good news about Omicron is it sounds like it's a virus in the end game. It's more contagious, less virulent. And that's what viruses do as they age out and turn into something like the common cold. On the other hand, as long as we have this guidance that we have to stay home for 5 days, 10 days, whatever, then it's hard to go back to business as usual and normal life.
And you're feeling fine?
Oh, yeah, I have a cold. I feel like I have a cold.
Yeah. I saw a meme on social media, and it was a World War II vet, and it had the list of symptoms, sneezy, runny nose, fatigue, cough, and it said, try taking a beach. Now,
look, people aren't saying that it's a horrible disease. What we're worried about is I have a 95-year-old mother. I have a cancer survivor husband. That's what and my family, of course, is all triple vaxxed. So I'm not worried about me, but, you want to be a sensible person.
Mm-hmm. All right, last word here. Matt, do you think that the messages are going to work themselves out? Do you think that Omicron is going to be the thing that gets endemic phase, and in that way we change, even though the health experts are saying one thing?
I look at Virginia, Brett, where, prior to Glenn Youngkin's election, everyone locked down the schools here in Northern Virginia for about 18 months. Youngkin was elected. We have Omicron hit. All of the counties in Virginia, including the blue counties, are saying they're going to try to keep schools open. I think the political reckoning that is headed our way in November 22 is what finally gets rid of a lot of these mandates and restrictions.
Meantime, the Supreme Court, Chad, is going to weigh in as well, and that will be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to have a case, of that nature, that's going to be very important. Democrats and Republicans have fought about this now for almost 2 years, and to have, a verdict handed down by the Supreme Court. And this comes at a time, of course, where the Supreme Court basically says, and Chief Justice Roberts alluded to this a week or so ago, that, the court is really having trouble staying above the fray of politics. Well, whether Justice Roberts likes that or not, whatever that decision might be, that's going to infuse the Supreme Court right back into the heart of this very touchy issue that's bedeviled us for the past 2 years.
That's right. Panel, thanks so much. Here's a bit of U.S. history. On January 3rd, 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signs a proclamation admitting Alaska as the 49th and largest state in the United States. The U.S. offered Russia $7.2 million for that land, which equates to approximately 1/5 the size of the rest of the country. There were concerns initially about admission, as statehood for the territory came during the height of the Cold War between communism and the free world. Being rich in natural resources, Alaska was, and still is, contributing to the country's wealth. Oil, commercial fishing, tourism, and cargo hub transportation are its most important job creators. Little Alaska history for you there. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and review. We want to hear from you. For Matt, Mara, and Chad, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time.
Listen to be part of the conversation with me, Brian Kilmeade. I'll talk about the biggest stories of the day and get your take along with some of the biggest newsmakers around. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the podcast at briankilmeadshow.com.